My name is Leslie Bartlebaugh. I'm part of the Urban Design Center, which is a department or an office of the City Planning Department for the City of Raleigh. And I manage the UDC Talks lecture series, UDC for Urban Design Center. It's typically a daytime series, but this year we decided to partner with the Dix Park planning team for the City of Raleigh to expand the series and kind of bring in bigger, bolder ideas that matter both to the city as well as to the Dix Park planning process. So there's a number of staff in the Urban Design Center as well as the Dix Park planning team that are here tonight, and they've been really amazing. And if you have any questions about either the Urban Design Center or the Dix Park planning process, please ask them. So can I ask my colleagues to raise their hands? Raise them real high. Lots of great folks from the city, so use us as a resource. So this series in particular, to focus more on the content of the series, we wanted to look at ideas that mattered both to Dix Park and to the city as a whole. So those included economic development and innovation, history, arts and culture, transportation, connectivity, I'm forgetting something, equity, access, inclusivity, and then nature and ecology, and that's what tonight's lecture will focus on. I want to thank, though, first, primarily, aside from thanking my team, the venue that you guys are in is North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. They're a really wonderful venue. Please come and check out all the exhibits. And thank you to the director, Emlyn Coster, who's really excited about the partnership with Dix Park and with the city for educational events like this and anything with regard to Dix Park. And then most definitely, I want to thank the Dix Park Conservancy, who is making this robust lecture series possible and is providing guidance and helping out with the venues and just the events overall. So thanks to the Dix Park Conservancy, we're excited for all the ideas and the things that are happening at Dix Park. So today, again, we're focusing on nature and ecology, and we have Florence Williams here to talk about your brain on nature. And I want to introduce my colleague, Caroline Lindquist, to talk more about Florence and the Dix Park. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Caroline Lindquist. I'm on the Dix Park planning team, as Leslie was explaining. Thank you again to the museum for hosting this event. And as Leslie was talking about, we have the Dix Park city staff team and the Conservancy have partnered with the UDC, really with the intent to challenge our level of thinking here within Raleigh as we move forward into the master planning process. So we encourage all of you guys to participate in this process as we move forward over the next 20 months. We'll have multiple opportunities for that. So now a little bit about Florence Williams. She is the author of The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative, which you can buy after the lecture out in the lobby, and she'll be signing as well. Florence is a contributing editor at Outside Magazine and a freelance writer for the New York Times, National Geographic, and numerous other publications. She is also the writer and host of a new podcast series, The Woman Factor, for Outside Magazine. A fellow for the Center of Humans and Nature and a visiting scholar at George Washington University, her work focuses on the environment, health, and science. She lives in DC with her family. Tonight, Florence Williams will discuss some of the latest research from around the world, probing the primal links between the human brain and the natural world, forming new evidence for why time in nature is critical to human creativity, health, and well-being. She will also explore how some cities and schools are already using this research to strengthen our connection to nature to improve our lives. Please welcome Florence Williams.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the City of Raleigh, and thank you to the museum. I've heard about this museum for years, and it's really a treat to be here and to be speaking here. I just snuck upstairs to look at the sloth. It's very exciting. And this is the city of oaks, right? And it's the summer solstice. So great time to be talking about the power of nature. So thank you for having me, and thanks for coming. As Caroline mentioned, I wrote a book called The Nature Fix, and I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I came to write it and sort of what I learned, some of the things I learned on the journey. Like a lot of things in my life, my curiosity was prompted by my own personal story And my situation was that I lived in the Rocky Mountains for 2 decades, and I had a backyard that looked like this. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., and I had a backyard that looked like this. So to get my daily nature fix, I had to cross a little freeway and scurry under a bridge embankment with a lot of graffiti, follow this chain link fence, and then I would finally get to my path. And there were low-flying jets going to Reagan National Airport every 2 minutes, basically 800 a day. So a little bit hard to feel the serene sense of nature. And I also, when I have 2 kids, we moved, and I felt like the streets in my neighborhood were a moonscape. There were no kids playing outside. And I think we all kind of freaked out a little bit after living in Boulder, Colorado. I noticed that my stress levels went up, my anxiety went up, I wasn't sleeping so well. I just felt out of sorts, like this cortisol bomb had gone off in my head. And I started to think more about the influence of our environment on our psychology. I had certainly been familiar with the terms like nature deficit disorder, and I started to really wonder what the science was behind that. Was it real, and was that part of what I was experiencing? Because certainly I like my daily fix of nature. I was used to it. I wasn't like Woody Allen, who once said, "I love nature, I just don't want any of it on me." I wanted it on me, and I missed it. Certainly for millennia, really, and certainly for centuries, we've been aware that poets and philosophers have long talked up the restorative and creative and psychological benefits of being outside. Thoreau, of course, had this great quote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential." But now, researchers are really starting to figure out what those poets and philosophers were talking about. So here's a quote from a team of neuroscientists and psychologists from 2008, where they say, "Imagine a therapy that has no known side effects, was readily available, and could improve your cognitive functioning at 0 cost. Such therapy has been known to philosophers, writers, and lay people alike, interacting with nature." So I decided to investigate this, and I was fortunate as a journalist to get 2 magazine assignments in a row, the first from Outside Magazine and the second from National Geographic, as part of their centennial celebration of national parks. So I did a piece called "Your Brain on Nature" for that. And the way I often do my reporting is that I participate in it myself. And so I subject myself to some of these various tests. And in the photo right there, I'm testing my cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone. Here I'm testing my heart rate variability after a walk in nature. And here I'm actually wearing a portable EEG unit. It's like a crown of thorns. And it measures your brain waves in different environments. So these are technologies that used to be really only available in the lab, and now we're able to sort of take them out and test them in real situations. So it's given researchers some new insights. So one of the first places I went was Japan, and that was the Outside Magazine story. Researchers there have been very interested in promoting and studying a practice they call Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. And basically what it involves is not taking off your clothes, but going out into the woods and really engaging all of your senses, sort of bathing in the sights, the smells, the sounds. There's a lot of tea drinking going on as well, a lot of deep breathing. And researchers have studied over 600 subjects who practice this forest bathing for just 15 or 20 minutes at a time. And what they found are these amazing physiological responses that occur after just 15 minutes. So we're seeing things like a drop in blood pressure, a drop in heart rate, 16% decrease in stress hormone cortisol. Also some indication that blood glucose levels are responsive to time outside, and that natural killer T cells, which are a critical part of the immune system, also seem to be decreasing after really these short visits in nature. And at first I was a little bit skeptical of this. I thought, well, of course people feel better and they feel relaxed because they're outside, they're walking around, they're getting some exercise. But the researchers thought of this also, and so they had controls where they sent some people to walk around for 15 or 20 minutes in a city and other subjects to walk around in the nature areas. And actually they switched them, various subjects switched. And consistently they really showed these positive effects after the nature walks and not after the urban walks. And that includes psychological measures that are more qualitative as well. Things like, how does your mood feel? What are your frustration levels like? And again, these benefits really only occurred after the nature walks. So Japan actually now has between 50 and 70 of what they call forest therapy trails. And the forest agency there is very actively encouraging stressed out office workers, especially from Tokyo, who work the longest hours of anyone in the world, to really get out of the office once in a while and go use these forest therapy trails. Also, Korea is taking a big cue from Japan. In fact, they've stolen some of the researchers from Japan. They're employing them in South Korea. South Korea now has 17 of what they call healing forests. Forests there used to be for recreation and timber, and now there's this whole new designation about healing specifically. It's actually in the National Forest Plan that the forests are to help people feel better. And to that end, they've trained 500 rangers who are healing therapy rangers. And they do some neat things. So this is one forest that I stumbled onto in South Korea, and it was a group of men doing things that I'm not used to seeing groups of men doing in the woods. I spent a lot of time in Montana. Most groups of men involved firearms, fishing poles, some Jim Beam. And these men were actually doing partner yoga. And they were meditating, and they were rubbing lavender oil into each other's forearms and making dainty floral collages, and also drinking a lot of tea. It turns out that this was a group of firefighters suffering from PTSD. And they were spending actually 3 days in the forest. And I said to them, well, how is this working for you? And they said they just loved it, and they wished they could live there forever. So they were really feeling the recovery. Among the benefits that the Korean researcher found is this 75% drop in anxiety levels after short visits to the forests. So now there are other programs for all kinds of people. This is a program led by one of the forest healing rangers, and she's leading a program for teens with digital addiction, which is a big problem in South Korea. I think probably those of us who have teens can maybe relate to this idea. And in this photo here, she's actually doing some forest art, some leaf art with the mothers. Because if you have an adolescent who's digitally addicted, chances are as a mom, you could also use some recovery time. So she does programs for them. And here she's actually leading an 11-year-old on a walk, and there's this cliff that just like drops away into this creek. And she says, look, if you're gonna compete with video gaming, you have to provide some level of risk for these kids. There has to be some excitement. They have to also be able to engage all of their senses, which they don't often do if they're sitting in front of one screen for many hours at a time. And so she has found that by actually doing some risky sort of adventure type behavior, you can actually compete with the games and also create some fun. This is a program in Scotland that I visited, and it's a forest therapy program specifically for people who are severely depressed and have recently been released from institutions, not really reintegrated back into sort of society. And it's a transition program. It's a 12-week program. The Scottish are very, very culturally connected to their forests. There's actually a new mandate, a new sort of standard in Scottish policy that says every person in Scotland has a right to live within 400 meters of a woodland. So they've made it this planning document, which I think is kind of profound and interesting. Here, this ranger is doing some gargoyle art on the trees. And I think it's kind of neat too, because you can see there's graffiti actually on these trees. Typically, a lot of the woodlands around Glasgow, which has a lot of economic disparity, a lot of drug addiction, a lot of mental health problems, a lot of crime. A lot of the woodlands have actually been used by sort of the hoodlums of these neighborhoods, who actually bring in these wheelie bins, these plastic wheelie bins. They light them on fire and they inhale the fumes and they get high. So there's actually this new mission there to clean out the garbage, to make the forests and woodlands feel safer. This guy is actually also leading a lot of programs for kindergartners and nursery schoolers, because once you get preschoolers in the forest, then other people feel safe using them. So there's kind of this active program to reach everybody in the neighborhood, not just sort of the specific groups. This is a horticulture therapy program I visited in Denmark, and every time I look at this hammock, I just want to dive in. It's also a 12-week program, and it's designed for also severely depressed patients who have what they call worker burnout, which isn't really a phrase we use a lot here, although I think probably a lot of us can relate to it. But these are people who've really been unable to go to work. And research in Denmark and in Sweden has shown that these horticulture therapy programs are actually as successful as any other intervention that they do. And those countries are now funding these programs. There are long waiting lists for them. They are also doing programs for people with stroke, recovering from stroke, refugees, people with trauma. And what's neat about these programs is it's very individual. So if you participate in these programs, the garden kind of becomes your oyster in a way, and you can engage with it as you feel ready. So when a lot of people enter these programs, their first weeks, they're really at a place where they're sensorially sort of cut off, not able to necessarily engage their whole bodies or all of their senses. And they might just curl up in a sleeping bag, because this is Northern Europe and this is a year-round program. And they'll just lie there for the 3 hours that the program lasts. And slowly what happens is their senses begin to wake up. They begin hearing the birds, they begin smelling the scents. Eventually they may begin picking some plants and making some tea. They may be starting to actually plant in the garden, talking to each other. So it's this very sort of easy way to engage with other people and also to kind of wake up. I think it's quite powerful. I also was fortunate enough to visit some forest kindergartens, which are really big in Europe, especially in Northern and Western Europe. I became so enamored of these programs, although at first, again, I was kind of skeptical because it's a wet, it's a damp, cold climate. I thought, don't these kids just want to sort of be inside and eating their snacks? But they actually love playing in the mud. It's all about, there's a saying there that there's no such thing as bad clothing. I mean, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. And so they provide these full Michelin Man snowsuits, full galoshes. and when you're dressed like that, you could actually go into any element. You can like wallow in the mud and you can wallow in the creeks, and that's what they do. I love this picture because this is a girl, and she's climbing pretty high up on this tree limb. And here's a younger girl who's just watching her sort of with awe. I think this is a neat kind of thing, because you don't see this sort of thing in the US very often, where kids are just allowed to sort of roam around. At this same preschool in Scotland, there was a little kid who ran by me with a junior hacksaw. And he was just running around with his hacksaw. And the head of the school just laughed, and she said, "Yeah, I know what you Americans think about stuff like this." And she said, "But here we have a philosophy that we don't really believe in mitigating risk. What we believe in is assessing hazard. And we feel that some of these hazards are appropriate because the kids are fully engaged." There's also kind of a gender aspect to this. There are studies that show in conventional playground settings, boys run around a lot more than the girls do. We see this in urban preschools. We know it because researchers are putting accelerometers on children. Everyone is concerned that most children are not meeting recommended levels of activity. We know obesity is really starting to show up in preschoolers and kindergartners. And yet in these outdoor spaces, the girls are approaching parity in terms of activity levels with the boys. And I think we don't tend to think of nature as being a gender neutralizing space, but it's kind of a powerful idea. And we know too from other studies that through adventure play, through nature play, through exploration, girls especially seem to really respond by improving self-esteem, improving aspects of leadership. We know that girls who spent more time outside as kids grow up to be more confident leaders in their jobs later on. That's based on a study by REI that recently came out. This is actually an urban kindergarten, but it's in downtown Edinburgh, and it's very garden-based. So it's a courtyard space, but it's filled with plants, it's filled with natural elements. Kids are outside almost all day. And again, here you have this, like, I don't know, 3-year-old, and he's carrying this huge pointy limb. And no one is telling him to put the limb down. He's just swinging it around, and if someone gets hurt, he'll learn his lesson. This is what I was told, and actually have a learning experience. And he seems pretty happy. So we know that adventure is one pathway for these kids to achieve some of the skills that they need in terms of resilience and in terms of self-esteem. But I'm really interested in another mechanism as well, and that is awe. And it's really an emotion that is not talked about very often. It's been sort of understudied as far as the positive emotions go in psychology. And it's sort of hard to explain even what it is. But this definition I sort of like, and it's that awe is an emotional response to perceptually vast stimuli that transcend current frames of reference. So in other words, it's something that blows your mind. And there's been a lot of new science about awe just recently. And what some of the science is revealing is that when we experience awe, it actually can increase our perception of time, so making us feel less stressed out that way. It makes us behave more generously to others. It makes us more community-minded. In a couple of interesting studies, researchers will show subjects just photographs of beautiful nature scenes versus more urban scenes, and then they'll ask them questions about how they feel or about themselves. And these slides are only flashed up for a couple of minutes or even 60 seconds, and maybe there'll be a series of 10 slides. And the subjects who are looking at the beautiful nature slides will say that they feel more intrinsically motivated as opposed to extrinsically motivated. So they'll respond higher on statements saying things like, I care about the relationships in my life. I am most motivated by an urge to help my community. And the ones who are looking at the city shots will say things like, they'll rate things like fame and money as higher. So that's kind of interesting. There's another study that shows that people who look at beautiful pictures of nature and then are asked to do a task, the people who saw the pictures of nature will actually do things like they'll fold more paper cranes to aid earthquake victims, for example, than people who are looking at less beautiful photos. In one of my favorite studies, this one is out of the University of California, Berkeley. It was led by Paul Piff, who's now at Davis, and Dr. Keltner at Berkeley. And what they did was they took a group of students to a grove of very tall, actually these are eucalyptus trees, fortunately not native trees, but a very kind of arresting stand of tall trees. They had them look up at the trees for 1 minute. And they had another group of students look up at a tall building on campus for 1 minute. And then, this is sort of clever, the research tech accidentally dropped a box of pens in front of each student, and then sort of surreptitiously counted how many pens the students helped pick up. And the students who were looking up at the tall trees picked up statistically more pens than the ones who gazed at the building. Reaffirming the hypothesis that if you experience awe, you will behave in a more pro-social and helpful way. Now, awe is an interesting thing. It actually does not have to be grand or beautiful. It can be, experiencing a butterfly landing in front of you. If it's something unexpected that pops into your brain and kind of captures your attention and seems, momentarily beautiful. It can be a religious experience. Of course, that's why throughout history so many cathedrals have been built. for these scaling effects, beautiful stained glass. A lot of dictators have, sort of benefited from the powers of awe by being a little bit mysterious and powerful and flanked by displays of wealth and so on. But 75% of the time that most of us experience awe, we experience it in nature. So it is an easy hit of nature. Einstein said the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mysterious. And awe gives us perspective. It makes us feel a part of something larger. And as Emerson famously said, it dissolves the self. He wrote, "Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and lifted into infinite space. All mean egotism vanishes." Awe makes us feel connected to community and to each other. Awe wants to be shared. This is a Girl Scout troop in DC, walking along near the Potomac River, not far from where I live. This is a little bit upstream, so not as many airplanes. And I will say just about this Girl Scout troop, actually, this is an urban troop, that some of the girls in this troop, these girls were about 10 years old, had a lot of trouble just hiking on the trail. And it's because they have never really walked on uneven surfaces before. So that was really eye-opening to me. A lot of kids just are not using all their gross motor skills. I know from speaking to pediatricians that we're seeing lags in gross motor development in kids now compared to little kids a generation ago. We know that they're spending vastly more time inside. So researchers are also interested in what happens to our brains when we experience awe. Or when we're outside. Are there biomarkers? Are there things you can see? So a neuroscientist out of Michigan did some experiments and showed that even just a 30-minute walk in an arboretum led to participants performing better on tests of memory and attention. And the same researcher, Greg Bratman, then imaged people's brains after a 90-minute walk. And he divided the groups into two, so he had them walk around the Stanford Dish in Palo Alto, not a wilderness area by any means, but a lot of greenery. He also had groups walk around El Camino Real in downtown Palo Alto, and he imaged their brains before and after. And he was specifically looking at a part of the brain called the subgenual prefrontal cortex, which is associated with ruminative thinking. Now, ruminative thinking is where we replay sort of negative episodes over and over again, and it's been highly correlated with depression. So he was really interested in seeing what happened to people's brains after 90-minute walks. And what he found in the urban brain was the subgenual prefrontal cortex was still highly engaged or activated, but in the nature brain, it really shrunk quite a bit. And the qualitative measures also affirmed this, that participants just felt better, they were in a better mood, they weren't as anxious as when they started the walks. So that was after 90 minutes. This is Dr. David Strayer, and he's a neuroscientist at the University of Utah. He's really interested in, okay, so if 90 minutes can do that, or if 1 minute of looking at a eucalyptus tree can do something, what happens to us after 3 days in the wilderness? What happens to our brains, and are there biomarkers for that? So he first did a pilot study on outward bound backpackers, and he gave them tests before and after their trip, and he found a 47% improvement after 3 days in the wilderness on tests of creativity. That was confirmed by another study recently looking at canoers, or canoeists, in the Boundary Waters that also showed 50% increase in creativity. But he also wanted to know if he could actually see anything in the brain. This is not really a real experiment. This is one of the photos for National Geographic, but it's kind of a neat photo. Again, it involves a portable EEG cap. So Strayer was also interested in the frontal cortex, but sort of a different part of it, a part where there are waves from midline frontal theta. Again, these seem to show high activation when we're doing things like multitasking, when we're responding to the constant stimuli of our modern everyday lives. And the theory here is based on what Rachel and Stephen Kaplan formulated in Michigan in the 1970s, a theory called the attention restoration theory. They noticed that people also felt better outside. And they were like, well, why? What is it about being outside? And the theory there is that when we're outside, we are not forced, our attention is not forced to engage with things like emails or sirens or red lights or parking spaces, which I know a lot about now in my new life in Washington, D.C. In fact, the stimuli comes at us at the speed of walking, basically. And guess what? That's really the speed that our brains evolved in. We're supposed to take in stimuli at a slower speed than we do in our lives now. And we don't really allow ourselves to recover as much from that stimuli as we need. And so what happens is the theory that our frontal cortex or prefrontal cortex gets overtaxed. And when that happens, we get grumpy. It basically fatigues us in a kind of, almost subconscious way. It makes us fatigued. And so maybe by being outside, we become a little bit less fatigued. It makes us cheer up. It makes us nicer people. So he did a study also to find out, well, what happens if we spend time in nature while we're multitasking? And of course, how many people here go outside with their phones? How many people are wearing earbuds with their phones? Right. Okay, so he was interested to know what happens. And what he found is that if you're outside, he had groups of students walk around that arboretum while calling their mothers or friend. So the mothers were happy that day. And then he had a group walking without their phones, and he gave them a test of what they saw on their walk through the arboretum. And the people who were on their phones performed as poorly on that test as people who didn't take the walk at all. So they experienced what he calls inattentional blindness. They really were not paying any attention to where they were. When he actually scanned their brains, he saw that their prefrontal midline theta was really, really active in the phone multitaskers and really not active in people who were not using the phone. So I think then the question really becomes, well, if the prefrontal cortex isn't activated, what parts of your brain are? Where is that blood flow going? And we don't know, is the short answer. But some of the theories seem to be maybe the parts of our brains that are associated with empathy or with creativity or with kind of long-term problem solving, long-term self-concept. That's something I'm really interested in because, of course, there's a ton of anecdotal evidence that when we spend time in nature, that's where we really think big. It's where we think about who we are and what our place is in the universe. Of course, many cultures throughout history have used time in the wilderness as a rite of passage, as an incredibly important time for especially young people reaching adulthood, right, to figure out sort of who they are and what their place is. While I was writing this book, I was really fortunate to attend a 6-day wilderness trip in the largest wilderness area in the lower 48. It's the River of No Return, otherwise known as the Salmon River, in the Frank Church Wilderness area in central Idaho. I was there with a group of women veterans, all suffering from PTSD. And when they first got there, this was a group of women who were unlike most people I run rivers with. They were filled with tattoos, a lot of physical disabilities, not a lot of chit-chat going on. This was largely a group of women who had not even left their homes in many months. Because when you're suffering from PTSD, you're in a state of kind of high alert, you're in a state of anxiety. These women typically don't sleep very well, they're not comfortable going out of their homes, they're not very curious about the world, you're sort of closed off in ways that they feel they need at that time for their nervous systems. But a really interesting thing happens when groups like this go out into the wilderness. And it's that the wilderness seems to provide a kind of anti-PTSD sort of effect. It actually draws your attention out. It focuses your attention out when you put these women in their little rubber duckies and send them down the rapids. you have to pay attention to what's coming up ahead of you. You have to engage, your senses are on. It's incredibly beautiful, so you're experiencing awe. You're feeling all of those senses become engaged. And it was really amazing for me to watch what happened, the transformation over the course of that 6 days. As these women really came out of their shells, as they started laughing, as they started talking, as they started sleeping better. And at the end of the trip, they were talking about their next nature adventures. They were buying surfboards. There was a fund set up through this program. They were buying mountain bikes. They were planning hikes together, and they were supporting each other in their sort of more conventional therapies that would be coming next as part of their treatment. So we know that the social aspects of being in the wilderness for these groups is actually very profound. Of course, the problem is that most of us do not live near the wilderness. Most of us live in cities. And I started to think about our access to nature as kind of a nature pyramid. I ran into this concept that's been really popularized by a designer, landscaper at the University of Virginia, Timothy Beatley. And what he talks about is our sort of typical nature dose and how to think of it that way. And at the bottom is this kind of everyday, nearby nature that we really still all need even when we live in cities. So it's our parks, it's our backyards, it's the treescape of the city, it's our office buildings, the landscaping. And then in the middle of this pyramid is where you get into sort of more intentional, longer immersions in nature. Of course, that's where your wonderful Dix Park comes in, these bigger green spaces where we can have more of a full sensory experience. And at the tippy top, this is sort of like the special dessert, and yet we still need this. This is really the wilderness experiences that we may get once a year or a few times in a lifetime. But when we start to think of nature allocation this way, we start to think of it as a necessity, all elements of it as a necessity, all levels for all people. And of course, the problem is that so many people who live in cities really don't have access to nature because we haven't thought of it this way and we haven't thought of it as a necessary diet. I wanted to visit the city of the future, and so I went to Singapore, which is actually the third densest city on the planet. It's also a country. And I was really interested in this kind of idea of our new habitat, really, because we're actually living in the middle of the largest mass migration in history, and it's the movement of people into cities. As of 2008, more people on the globe lived in cities than outside of them. That was a threshold, really profound threshold. One anthropologist suggests that we now call ourselves metro sapiens. We're in a new habitat, and we haven't necessarily figured out how to do it very well. Of course, the United States is currently about 70% urban. And yet we know that people value their time in nature. 74% of adults say that nature is very or extremely important to their emotional outlook. This is true for parents as well. 90% of parents say that their kids are actually happier when they're outside. 89% say their kids are healthier. 80% more confident. And yet, we know that these kids are not getting outside. In one study, 79%, I think it was 79, about 72% of mothers say that they played outside as kids every day when they were young. And yet that same group, only 29% of them say that their kids play outside every day. So, I mean, think about that. That's a huge shift in one generation. There are a lot of barriers to getting outside. There's a disconnect between our desire and our action. So this is my city, this is Washington, D.C., and there's pretty profound change in the tree cover. The tree cover in D.C. went from 50% to about 35% by actually about 1997. The tree cover now in DC, went down to 35%. It's come back up to 38%, and actually Washington, DC has a goal to get the tree cover back to 40% by 2020. So that doesn't sound like very much, a few percentage points, but it ends up being like 700 football fields worth of trees that have to be planted. So there is an active campaign going on. A lot of cities are doing this. We know that trees are, of course, incredibly valuable for the ecological services they provide as well, for providing clean air and filtration. But this is really interesting. In Singapore, which has also experienced huge growth in that same time period, the opposite happened. So Singapore went from having 35% green cover to having 50% green cover. And they did this through policies. So here's an example of how policies can really make a difference in your everyday bottom of the pyramid urban nature. Among those policies are that if you build an office building, you have to more than replace the green space that you took away. So you're now seeing things like these crazy hairy gardens. Of course, there's a lot of rain, so things grow on these office buildings. And they're habitat. They're providing habitat now for birds and butterflies. There are gardens inside office buildings. So this is an atrium inside a building. It provides a very restorative workspace or lunch space in the middle of the day. So this is my hotel in Singapore, thanks to National Geographic. It's the Park Royal. And here's a naked person swimming in the pool. When my cab driver dropped me off at this hotel, he said, "Oh, you're so lucky you're staying here. When you wake up in the morning, you get to browse." Not as in internet browsing, but as in eating the grass. But it's not just the fancy buildings and the fancy offices and hotels that are incorporating these green designs. This is worker housing way outside of the downtown. The canals in Singapore have been unzipped and sort of daylit. They've been brought out to the surface and landscaped with hiking trails and biking trails, lots of new vegetation, lots of birds. This is a hospital in Singapore. Again, it's very out of the mainstream tourist area. This hospital, Kutek Puat, has become almost a tourist attraction now because it's so unique in terms of its landscaping on every level. The windows open, you can smell the plants, you can hear the birds. There are restorative gardens for patient visitors as well as for the nursing staff. And the biophilic design has been incorporated into sort of just the inside of the building as well. The nursing uniforms have leaves and vegetation on them. And there's also an effort to really connect what they're doing to biodiversity and to the biodiversity index of Singapore. So there's a sense that not only people are recovering in this hospital, but species are recovering as well. So how do we create more spaces of awe where people live? There are a number of cities that are doing some really interesting things. This is in Tacoma, outside of Seattle, and it's a tidal walk where kids can experience finding things like sea stars, and again, you see this kind of awe that you can experience every day right in a city. This is neat. This is actually in Wellington, New Zealand, and it's a snorkel trail. That's just a few steps from downtown Wellington. So you can plop in here with your snorkel on and go check out the fish. And this is in the San Gabriel Mountains outside of LA, really in LA. It's a wonderful new wilderness area. And you see many new programs to get kids and parents outside. California has a terrific parks prescription program where you see doctors prescribing parks for some of their patients, especially their pediatric patients. You know, doctors who go to med school, they're not really told that nature is a good intervention. And so it's really taken some kind of creative and rogue doctors out there figuring this out. And what they say is, you know, we see in our young patients, we see all these chronic diseases that are growing so rapidly, like diabetes, obesity, anxiety, depression. These are not things we've been effectively able to treat. And when we encourage our young patients and actually facilitate them getting outside through busing programs, through partnerships with local and state parks, we're seeing tremendous improvement in our patients anecdotally. Not a lot of hard science yet about how well this works, but it's starting to happen. One doctor I spoke to, Nushin Razani in Oakland, works in an inner city hospital there. She said, the most amazing thing is that you don't just see these kids improving, but you see their families getting outside too. And when the families go outside, you see not only physical exercise happening, but you see joy. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Florence? We don't have a mic, so
Project loudly.
project. Ashton, I think I saw your.
Looking at some of these green spaces and wondering what the threshold for enough green is. Is it trees on the sidewalk? Is it a full park enclosure space? Like, where's the line between green and then talking about green spaces versus even natural settings like beaches and lakes? Does it have the same impact?
Okay, great. So two-part question. The first is really, I think, about kind of almost dose again. How much do you need? And I don't think the science has really drilled down, exactly this many trees equals this health benefit, and this much lawn yields this much health benefit. But actually some studies will show that even, and I mentioned some of the awe studies, if you look at a photo, there's an effect. There are studies that show if you're in a room with potted plants, you actually behave differently than if you're not in a room with potted plants. So I have this new campaign that I've thought up, which is that we all need to bring ficus plants to Congress. And we need to spread them all over Congress. And the second part of your question had to do with different elements of nature, ocean versus forest, right? So again, not a lot of drilling down. I think my theory, and I know this to be true, is that there just is a lot of individual variation, right? Someone might love the ocean and feel really at peace there, but someone else might feel like too much space. I hate it. So what I like to encourage is for people to just pay attention to how they feel when they're in different environments and just know kind of what your happy space is. And chances are that you do, but maybe you don't know how beneficial it actually is. The research has shown that we really undervalue nature, and we undervalue how good it will make us feel. We think that watching Netflix and eating ice cream and going shopping will make us feel really great. It does for a little while, but we don't tend to think of nature as part of that toolbox. So I encourage people to be mindful when they are outside. I've had to learn how to do this myself. I now take my earbuds out. I make an effort to smell, the leaves and to listen to the birds. And if I can do that, I feel like I get a more powerful, sort of more efficient hit of the restorative benefits of nature. And I know which kinds of environments I like. I tend to be a river person, and everyone's going to be different. And I don't know if it has to do with, your childhood memories or, your nostalgia for how you grew up. I think that's part of it, which is why it's so important, right, to get kids outside. Because if they don't establish that relationship early on, they risk not ever having it.
So I really liked the part of your book where you talked about daylighting water and making it louder than the traffic going by in a really busy highway. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Yes, I can. I visited a project in the middle of Seoul in South Korea. Very, very hyper-dense downtown area where an underground kind of ditch has been daylit, landscaped, sort of like that picture I showed you. But it was designed by acoustic specialists. And so it was kind of like sunken into a little bit of a canyon, so that there are kind of these waterfalls every once in a while, the sound of moving water. And when you're down there, you actually cannot hear the street traffic. It drowns it out. And it's also brought in a lot of birds. So it's still sort of loud, but we know that the most restorative sounds to human ears include birdsong and the sound of water. And so when you're down there, it's actually this great hit of restoration. So it's a way that you can bring in acoustic engineers, city planners, to really make a difference in the daily lives of downtown residents and office workers.
Other questions? Oh, back in the back. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. And then we'll go to you.
My next?
Here you go. There's a microphone right here.
Oh, thank you very much. My question relates to the water feature that you describe in Seoul.
Yeah.
Compare that to what San Antonio did with the Riverwalk situation and how that has improved that city's outdoor scene and nature scene.
Okay, I'm not an expert in sort of the effects or the benefits of that. I have been there a couple of times, and it's a beautiful space. It's certainly become a huge tourist attraction. There are restaurants, there are shops, people sit outside and have dinner. Have you experienced that? Is it something that you enjoy?
I have yet to experience it. I want to, but it sounds very similar to what you described in Seoul because I think they created that from a drainage ditch.
Oh, is that right? That's interesting. Well, certainly we're seeing a lot of city projects like this, the High Line in New York City. Cities are putting a lot of investment into these parks. You're doing that here in Raleigh with your Dix Park. And I think the cities are seeing tremendous gains, a lot of use in these new outdoor spaces.
My question is about spending time outside in the summertime here, for example, will mean water. Pools, get a lot of summertime use here, and we have a lot of outdoor pools. Do you know if there's any research that shows that's beneficial, or is the noise of being at the pool drowning out the effects or the positive effects of being outside? Any idea?
I would say if you get kids outside playing, being active, enjoying themselves in a sensory way with water, I think it's tremendous. It's fantastic. I do think it can be loud, if you have public pools with huge groups of kids. So if you live right next to those, you may experience it in a different way than if you are a kid. But there actually is a lot of research showing the psychological benefits of being near water. Certainly a lot of people respond very positively to being near water. And it makes sense from an evolutionary sort of biophilic standpoint. I mean, we evolved to believe that water could help us survive. And so when we feel water, it sort of relaxes us in a way of, oh, we can survive here, we can be happy.
So I'm coming from the Sonoran Desert.
Oh, nice.
So in a lot of this, I'm hearing, greening spaces, and a lot of the imagery we associate with nature is, leaves, greenery, trees, like not succulents, but trees. So you had a few examples of, ocean, other types of habitats. Is it kind of a young field, and like most of the research is still happening in very green spaces, or has the research started like penetrating less like traditionally what we associate with nature?
Yeah, again, great question. What about arid deserts that aren't so green? But I did show a couple of shots from Utah. So there was that Lador Canyon, that neuroscientist I talked about, David Strayer. He's done a lot of his research in canyon country. So there is some good research happening in deserts and in Utah. If you're someone who responds to the desert and feels great there, and I love the desert, it certainly has every bit as much potential, to help you recover from stress as being in a forest. And not everyone's going to feel comfortable in a forest. It can be a very confining, kind of claustrophobic environment. So I think we will see more research. There's a ton of research in this field now, just cropping up, and it is looking at different elements of nature, different environments, different doses, different outcomes. Who is most helped by nature exposure? So, stay tuned. I think it's a really exciting field.
If the sky was the limit, what 2 or 3 things would you build into your favorite urban park setting?
I really appreciate that question.
I really have one big one, and that would be programs to actually get people to use it. So anyway, especially kids, and especially kids who don't necessarily normally have access to those parks. So that's the thing. You can have as many beautiful parks as you want, but if no one's using them, it's not necessarily doing that much good. So my passion right now is really kids, getting kids outside and getting kids from all areas outside and to make it more accessible. So I know that's something that your museum is working on, and there are some great programs in your city, so way to go. Take a kid outside, take a grandkid outside. There's actually, we know that even like parents of small kids now, even those parents aren't necessarily very nature connected, but the grandparents tend to be still nature connected. And so it's this fabulous role for grandparents, I think, to share that with their grandchildren. It might have to skip a generation in some cases, but we've got to keep sharing it or the chain gets broken. And then those next generations of kids don't get outside.
We probably have time for 2 more questions. Leslie?
So it's great that you were talking about kids, because my question is actually about that. Considering, the rising levels of obesity and lack of nature for kids, have you gotten the chance to give any lectures to maybe like administrators to encourage, more nature-related recesses or the type of programs that you saw abroad, bringing them here and enacting them, in the U.S.?
That's a great question. I haven't really, so if you know anyone, please give them my book. I think that a lot of our American institutions are pretty entrenched in a way that is not so friendly to time outside. And part of that is our culture of liability, part of it is habit, part of it is just the comfort level of the teachers and the administrators. I know in my son's middle school, the kids were not getting recess outside at one point. And my son, I asked him, well, how much time outside do you get? And he said, oh, we haven't had recess for months. And I was like, what? And so I talked to his principal, and she said, well, it's been so muddy. And so it was a janitorial problem. And I just felt like, well, maybe instead of buying all these kids iPads, we should be buying them galoshes. I visited Finland for this project. And in Finland, in the elementary schools, the kids have to go outside for 15 minutes of every 45 minutes of instruction. So that's like 5 recesses a day. And I said to the teachers, I was like, and oh, by the way, they keep their galoshes by the door. Their galoshes are right there. They slide into them, they run out. I said, wow, that's a lot of time away from the classroom. And she said, well, if we didn't do it, they wouldn't be able to sit still and they wouldn't pay attention. And I was like, oh. And you hear so much about how Finland has like the highest test scores in the world. And people are always talking about, oh, it's because of the teachers having great education and it's because of this culture of respect, blah, blah. You never actually hear anyone talking about the recess. But the teachers will tell you it's the recess.
With the progress that we see elsewhere in the world, when do you think, or how long do you think it will take to make a major paradigm shift here in the U.S.?
That depends on all of you. I think parents need to get involved in their school policies. I think city residents need to get involved in changing policy and planning. I think the medical community needs to come on board and have access to more of this research. So I think there are a lot of hurdles yet, in this country before we really sort of embrace this as a major cultural influence. But I just hope that the message gets out. I'm so happy to see so many of you here tonight. And I encourage you to stay really active and to get your kids outside.
Let's another round of applause for Florence. Thank you.